Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Israel Dialogues. Um, I join the rest of the world, the rest of the Jewish world today, in just being miserable and shocked and horrified at the murder of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram in Washington, D.C. Um, these two young people who were staff at the Israeli embassy, German, Israeli, American, active in coexistence work, active in peace work, um, at an event explicitly for peace work, at an event exclusively for turning sorrow into hope and turning your frustration in the current moment into action to help the world, to help Israel, to help Palestinians. And they were murdered last night. And I have no meaningful words at this moment, other than to say that our hearts are broken for their families, our hearts are broken for our people, and our hearts are broken for the good they would have done in the world. Um, there is a level of toxic conversation going on in the world. Uh, Accusations of many things. I've heard the word blood libel more in the last 2 days than I have heard it in 5 years. And I know that today our conversation will be very emotional for many people and very charged. And so my request of all of us, both panelists and participants who want to ask questions of our panel, is to act with Rahmanis, to act with compassion, and to act with Ahavat Am, to act with love of our people, and to assume the best of each other, and not to jump to rage and jump to frustration and jump to accusations, because we are seeing what that brings into the world, with the terrible deaths of these two young people last night, as we see a form of radicalization and distrust and hatred blossoming all over the world. And so, having said those things, I'm going to pass it over to Professor David DeWitt to introduce our panel today. Thank you, everyone.
Rabbi, thank you so much. Your opening comments are make us all pause and think, reflect, and I think it is an unfortunate yet significant example of why things like the Israel Dialogues and other programs in other communities are important, so that difficult issues in the real world can be challenged, can be addressed, can be unpacked, can be understood uh, with some degree of, I was going to use the term dispassion, but passion is an important part of being human and having strong feelings, um, but with a sense of um, integrity and honesty and listening to the other. And it's ironic that our session today is what it is because the focus is on the notion of civil society, which is so fundamental to what many of us imagine should be a core part of a healthy liberal democracy. And I apologize, this is me as a lapsed political scientist speaking, but there has been far too much easy sliding into the use of the term of democracy as if democracy without adjectives um, is really something that is necessarily and inherently good and socially responsible. And yet we know that that's not the case. That democracy comes with attributes that often sows the seeds of its own destruction. And too often we've assumed that if you have elections, that's democracy and that's sufficient, that it represents the people. And we know as scholars, as activists, as citizens, that's not the case. There are many other things that make up a healthy democracy. And civil society, the ability of individuals to collectively come together in organizations of their own choosing, constructed so that they can seek out social and political and economic goods and services, what political scientists, sociologists call, and economists call public goods, to the benefit of themselves, and one hopes to the benefit of the larger society. So even though there are civil society organizations that span the political spectrum, um, so long as they don't spew hate and vilify others, they have a place for debate and for construction of the democratic politics in which we all hope to reside. And so I'm really very pleased that Ben Moraine is able to join us today to lead us in discussion of this. As you will have seen from the brief bio note that was sent out, Ben is currently the executive director of the New Israel Fund of Canada, and he's been a leading voice of engagement with Israel. For over 12 years, Ben has led at the intersection of Jewish life, social justice, and Israel. He previously has worked as a New Israel Fund's American branch. He's won Jewish Innovation Awards for his work in environmentalism and campus life. He founded both online and offline Jewish communities. In 2012, he received the prestigious Dorot Leadership Fellowship in Israel, where he studied Zionism and worked at a political think tank. Ben is a thoughtful and leader of a respected activist organization. But his mandate today is not to speak on behalf of the New Israel Fund, but rather to bring his expertise and his insights to what it means to be part of civil society, the broad range of civil society organizations, how they function, what they do, their differences, civil society organizations in Israel and their importance to the domestic politics and society of Israel, but also civil society in the Jewish diaspora, which, as we know, have deep connections and often affect policy and the lives of Israelis, just as civil society organizations in Israel often affect those of us in the Jewish diaspora. So with that, let me invite you, Ben. Thank you for giving your time and sharing your expertise. I know you have a presentation, and then we'll be able to pursue it further in the Q&A, in which I'll initially be inviting John Allen, Rabbi Kay, and Leth Rothschild to ask questions of you, to lead some discussion. And I encourage those who are viewing to submit their questions to the Q&A that you'll find at the bottom of your screen. Ben, thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thanks, David, and thanks to the Israel Dialogues team, to Rabbi Sam. Thank you for inviting me, and I'm, affected as much as everyone else is by the news last night and this morning. It's like so important to condemn political violence of any kind from any direction in the strongest terms. And in a moment of grief and fear and despair, how important it is to resist the pull into despair and instead to hold fast to the hope that a better, more peaceful future is possible. And I think that's the information I hope to share with you today is a lot of examples of Israeli society resisting that pull into despair. And so I hope that we make I can technically teach you a little bit about the vibrancy of Israeli civil society today, but also to show you some, like, I think, really inspiring examples that give me strength to get through the day. Days like today when things can feel really, really awful. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for joining me. I'm gonna go be a little bit of a wannabe professor for a second, and I'm gonna sort of let's talk about, what is civil society? How does it fit into democracy? Where did civil society get its start in Israel? We'll go through that pretty quickly, and then I just want to give you a litany of examples of some of the post-October 7th, a little bit before, and certainly in the past, really the past 2 years immediately before and after October 7th, of civil society initiatives in Israel, and what those have looked like and what they have meant for Israeli society at large. And then I also want to go the full breadth, and I want to show you also some of the civil society which is on the opposite end of the political spectrum from, say, myself, and I know many members of the Reform community. The truth of it is, the Reform community in Israel relies on civil society for its own advancement and its own protection. And so, of course, in this pantheon is the Israel Religious Action Center, and there are some groups in Israel that really don't like the Reform community and want to dismantle it. So we'll also talk about those, just to sort of show, like, Israel's got all of them. So with that, I welcome your questions throughout the presentation. Go ahead and drop them into the chat. We will get to them only at the end. So hopefully we'll get to those in due time. So with that, I'm gonna jump in. Let me screen share. I like to have some visuals. Here we go. I want to share. Here we go. Okay. So let's talk about civil society in Israel from progressive to extremist. First of all, what are we even talking about? People have been using this word. I have heard the word civil society used by the common person so much more in the past 2, maybe 3 years, and I really cannot tell if I heard it used so much before that. What do we mean by civil society? Civil society, typically organizations, but also activist groups. They don't have to be, official standing organizations. They're a critical part of democracy because they are actually the connective tissue between a government and its people. People are individuals. A government is a monolith. Who's going to represent different groups of the population to the government or to society in order to push for change or advocate for their needs? This is one of the important critical components of a healthy democracy. You need the independent judiciary. You need a separation of powers of the various branches of government. You need a free media, and you also need an active civil society. There's other ingredients too, but if any one of these things is weak, it will be difficult for a democracy to maintain equality and fairness for everyone. The weaker these are together, the weaker a democracy you have. Many of the ways we measure democracy in countries around the world is ranking them on these various things. So civil society is one of the most important pillars of them. What does civil society do? It connects citizens to their government. They are watchdogs over government, monitoring that they are doing what they are saying they are doing. They promote civic participation. So, you should get out and vote, or that you should go to the town hall and participate in this. There's this important issue coming up. They advocate for minority rights. I think this is one of the most easily recognizable functions of civil society. They foster a culture of democracy at large. They protect and strengthen democratic institutions. They address corruption, and they monitor and evaluate how various issues are doing in society. And here's a bunch of Canadian ones. There's the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, right? There's a big debate over, let's say, the bubble legislation around, religious houses of worship and community centers and schools, and who's allowed to protest close to them and near to them, and what's the balance between, the right to protest and the protection of vulnerable communities. So institutions like the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, they're the expert. They sort of weigh in on some of that stuff. You have women's groups, you have Jewish groups, you have LGBT groups, you have environmental groups. We're going to talk about the Israeli equivalents of a lot of these things. So you can buffer in your mind, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about civil society. Lord knows how much the Jewish community has built many institutions, many civil society groups. It's B'nai B'rith, or it's New Israel Fund, or it's CIJA, or it's the Reform Action Center in Washington, D.C. All of these are institutions the Jewish community built in order to advocate for our needs to wider society, or even within our own corner. When did civil society start in Israel? One of the most interesting things, one of the most miraculous parts of Israel's story is that it, built institutions of government and a society from a bunch of primarily but not exclusively immigrants who came to the land during its founding years. It is fair to say that there was a civil society on the ground that converted itself into institutions of government. But that actually at the time, there wasn't much civil society in Israel. And actually for many years, for many of Israel's initial decades, that persisted. There were soccer associations, doctor associations, those are also civil society. But in terms of a robust, active civil society, which is pushing the government, representing different pockets of society, it didn't really happen until the 70s. And if anybody can take a moment to guess, what happened in the 70s that so accelerated the development of Israeli civil society? It's this guy. 1977 was the first election in Israel where the Labor Party, or the components of the Labor Party, lost an Israeli election. The election of a more right-leaning Israeli government came from a few factors and produced a couple factors. What else was going on in the world in the 70s? There were the feminist movement of the 70s, racial equality of the 70s, decolonization of the 70s, all of these things where there was a global conversation around the rights of the minority, and justice and equality and democracy and a lot of these things. That was especially in contrast to, say, the Soviet Union. So this was a thing that was happening all around the world. Of course, it was happening in Israel too. And there was a percolation up from the ground of groups in Israeli society that were beginning to assert themselves in the public discourse. And one of them was greatly responsible for the election of Israel's first right-leaning prime minister. The Jewish immigrants from Arab-speaking worlds, called Mizrahim or Sephardim, they had been under-prioritized. They had been discriminated against by the Ashkenazi elite of Israel, which was the founding class of Israel. And for many decades, it sort of advocated for their needs and not seen their needs met. And so in this election in particular, a huge swath of those citizens of Israel switched their vote from one party to another and helped catapult Menachem Begin's representation in Knesset to a commanding share. And that happened because the Mizrahi community began to organize itself and say, this is what we need and we're not getting it. And so we're going to change sides, our loyalties, our voting preferences, we're going to go to somebody else. That's a really important piece of civil society, advocating as a group for what your needs are. And if the government's not giving it to you, you switch. That's one important piece. At the second piece, there was this is the heyday of the early days of Israel's feminist movement, the early days of Israel's the reform community beginning to organize for its needs. This is the beginning of the environmental movement, the beginning of lots of really important pieces of Israeli society. There was a fomentation of this at this point of realization, the government is not giving us what we need and we need to advocate for it. Whatever our slice of Israel, our pocket of Israel, our tribe within Israel needs. After Menachem Begin's election, actually, you saw a conspicuous, another piece of this was that basically, if you were a liberal-leaning person, a liberal-leaning voter in Israel at this time, you had been well represented in Israeli government because your you know, the chances are your political party was the Labour Party or part of its coalition members. And so you had well faith that the government was taking your interests to heart because you were represented there. It was your choice of your people, your parties in power. But after the Labour Party's constituents lost power and were now in the opposition, they also realized, like, that right-leaning government is not going to, like, we need to organize ourselves to be sure that we are heard by a government that opposes us or doesn't include our voices. And so there was a further organizing of Israeli society on the other side of the political spectrum as well. All over, people began to realize, especially with the Menachem Begin's emphasis on privatization of the, like, privatizing government services and giving them over to the private sector, you know, it provoked people to say, well, we're going to have to fight to keep this or keep that, or to oppose this or to oppose that. So, or also if things were being privatized, to create institutions that would handle those things, since the government wasn't going to handle it anymore. So this is the reason why really we can say Israeli civil society really got going in the late 70s and early 80s. And indeed through the late 70s, early 80s and into the early 90s, we see some of Israeli civil society's most amazing accomplishments. Look, Israel did not emerge out of the sand in 1948 with world-class gay rights. Israel had just as crappy gay rights and women's rights as every other democracy at the time. It was those achievements before the Supreme Court in legislation and in societal attitudes was achieved over time by groups of civil society pushing for equality, pushing for democracy, and usually over the sincere or insincere objections of whoever was in power at the time, whether it was Labour or Likud or whomever. The story of Israel is like the story of Canada, an imperfect place that has built itself and sought improvement over time. And that is true for Israel too. So in the 80s and in the early 90s, that's when you see a lot of the incredible Supreme Court victories of, say, women's rights, gay rights, the right of religious freedom in Israel, that if you're an Orthodox person who does not work on Shabbat, that the public bus system cannot fire you because you don't work on Shabbat. That is a thing that happened. The public Israeli bus system fired an Orthodox guy because he would not work on Shabbat, and his job was reinstated by legal groups going to the Supreme Court saying, you can't do that. It's against the separation of church and state. It's discrimination. And that happened also with the Arab minority. So I could spend 2 hours describing all the incredible things that make Israel a place with world-class civil and human rights. For its majority. But we're not going to do that. I actually want to skip forward because I think there's more recent stories to tell. Let's get into some of, like, you know, what happened before and after October 7th. So before October 7th, what was happening? This was happening. Before October 7th, we had a new government, the most right-wing government in Israel's history, come in with a published platform that they wanted to dismantle some of the most important parts of democracy. And that animated and alarmed a huge, an unprecedented swath of Israeli society in order to protect democratic institutions like the courts or the media or civil society itself. And so in this period, you know, the early 2020s in Israel is the period when we have seen the most growth in new civil society groups since the 70s. You know, Israel had no civil society groups at its founding, or maybe dozens. Now it has tens of thousands. And in this past period, we've seen the development of so many more. These protests brought out hundreds of thousands of people. And just as an example, these protests were held in 72 different locations by 200 official groups, all coordinating together. So you would have multiple groups organizing this big one in Tel Aviv. So maybe it's just a couple organizations in different places, but they all represent different sectors of society. I'm sure you've seen the green banners of the sort of brothers in arms and the sisters in arms, you know, Achim Beneshek. those groups that were before October 7th saying they were soldiers or reservists saying if we protected Israel's borders and now we won't serve if you pass the judicial overhaul. So that's a really powerful example of Israeli civil society. And that one was really across the spectrum from sort of the center right all the way to the other end of the political spectrum. It was surprisingly like multi-political. So I want to make sure that we're talking about the pro-democracy camp in Israel is really politically diverse. But a lot of different voices were seen here. You saw right-wing groups, centrist groups, progressive groups, all coordinating in these protests. It was really quite a phenomenon. I think we can definitely say we cannot find another example anywhere in the world of this portion of the population that came out weekly for 9 months. Anywhere in the world history, we cannot find a parallel example that matches the strength, power, and breadth of these demonstrations. It's an incredible story. Obviously, what happened next was October 7th. And I don't need to get into all the horrible things that happened on that day. One of the horrible things that happened on that day was, aside from the security failure and the military failure, part of what happened that day was actually the Israeli government, the institutions of government, the state, did not respond quickly or at all to the needs of displaced Israelis in the aftermath of the massacres. So let's get into sort of like what happened overnight is that these organizations, which had been doing protests, which had been doing, legal advocacy or talking about constitutional reform and these sorts of things in every corner of the country, overnight became humanitarian aid delivery. This is a photo of a hotel in the Dead Sea. These are children from the Gaza envelope from Kibbutzim there. And you can see the blue T-shirts of, the Zionist youth movement, young people, members. Overnight, these 200 organizations whose job was, public demonstrations, converted themselves into the delivery of aid, food, medicine, housing. The Israeli government failed to do this. And when you talk to Israelis across the political spectrum, what do you hear? You hear that the state is supposed to have, we're a country that feels perpetually on the brink of war. Shouldn't we have a plan for what if we actually go to war? What do they do if I can't get to my house? What if I can't get to my job? How do I pay my mortgage now? How do I get aid meet? Oh, my kids have trauma. This is not something the Israeli government should have been unprepared for. It's reasonable to expect a state to care for its citizens. And overall, it was civil society that stepped into that vacuum. I can go on at great depth about that. But this, again, is the way that Israeli society pivoted on a dime and came together to support themselves in this moment is another incredible story of civil society. And it happened everywhere. Another piece of civil society that you all might be very familiar with, I'm sure you've all seen these posters, these red iconic posters by the Hostages and Families and Missing Persons Families Forum. Many of these examples are connected to New Israel Fund because they're partners of ours or because, every organization pitched in greatly to help Israeli civil society in its moment of need. One of the things that I'm the most proud of is that we were one of the seed funders of this institution. And this institution was first founded in the immediate days, 2 days after October 7th, because no one knew how many people were missing. No one knew who was dead. No one knew who was kidnapped. And again, the government wasn't doing it. And so Israeli society took that upon itself, and this group coalesced. The other part that this government noticed, or that the families and the friends of people missing noticed, was that this government did not go to war in a way that was taking care of those who may have been kidnapped to Gaza. So almost immediately, this organization became a movement of people demanding that the Israeli government work to bring the hostages home. You know, the basic observation was in those first days of the Gaza offensive, Israel's response to what Hamas did, you don't drop 2-ton bombs on neighborhoods in Gaza if you're worried that beneath those houses are your citizens. And so this organization converted itself almost immediately into an advocacy organization. Bring them home at any cost. Let as many, terrorists in jail go. Leave Hamas in power. Don't complete the grand vision of a total victory. If that's the price of bringing home my daughter or bringing home my Saba. So it's very ironic that out here in the diaspora, these posters are somehow some sort of a pro-Israel, generic thing. In Israel, these are an anti-government poster, and that is an important part of citizens advocate to their government because the government is accountable to itself or to only its voters. And this government hasn't been popular since it got elected. It would lose an election every single poll since it got elected. What else did, I mentioned that Israeli civil society converted overnight into humanitarian aid. This is an interesting example of one of those things. This is the Jewish-Arab joint relief distribution center in Rahat. Rahat is a Bedouin town in Israel's Negev. These are Jewish and Bedouin Arab residents of the Negev who, because they live next to each other, of course, they all had to flee their communities, their homes. They all needed food. They all needed a place to stay. They needed medicine. And this is an inspiring example by an organization called Have You Seen the Horizon Lately? It came out of the medical field where Jewish and Arab, Palestinian citizens of Israel, Israeli Arabs, are a disproportionate number of professionals in the medical field. And so out of the coexistence of sort of medical rooms and the hospital environment came many of these joint initiatives to take care of everybody in society and not just the Jews. Another amazing extension of that is, some of these Jewish Arab organizations, joint Israeli citizens, they paid visits to members of the hostage families. And some of those hostage families were Bedouin. There were and remain Bedouin that had been kidnapped into Gaza. And so this was a way of saying, we're all in this together. The Hamas did not discriminate between Jewish citizens or Arab citizens. We all lost family on that day, and we all are missing family that day. Missing family still. So, some of these important solidarity actions, especially when the Israeli government and some of the far-right civil society, which we'll get to later, we're making a point of saying this is Jews versus Palestinians. And all Jews are good and all Palestinians are bad. All Arabs are bad. Another important thing that civil society did was trying to, the Israeli government has resisted any of the efforts to investigate what went wrong with the security, what went wrong on October 7th, before, during, or afterwards. So it fell to civil society to explain, why did October 7th happen? Why did the state fail to take care of its own citizens in the immediate aftermath? These are big, big questions, especially when, Netanyahu and the government himself got elected on a platform of we'll give you security, get us to security, we'll give you the best security you've ever had. And then Israel's worst tragedy in one of its worst tragedies ever happens. So how do you explain that? How on your watch did you permit something that you promised us would never happen? And that was a great number of failures and got a lot of context and a lot of explanation. And this is an organization these are 3 think tanks: Baruch Katznelson Center, Molad, the Center for the Renewal of Israeli Democracy, and its publication Telem, that produced, this is the English language version, but there's Hebrew language versions of explaining the components of how did we get here? How did we get here? Why was the Netanyahu government with loads of money from Qatar giving it to Hamas and keeping it in power? Why is it, were there other paths not taken in the way to get here? Again, this is another example of grassroots community organizing across Israel. There was a great number of people who, decided that the message of revenge coming out of the Israeli government in certain parts of the Israeli right was damaging to Israeli society. So they made efforts like this to say that we actually don't hate each other. We don't hate other citizens, and we don't hate our Palestinian minority. This is an example of like conferences all over Israel that happened. This is people holding up in Hebrew and Arabic signs that say B'yachad, which means together. This is that same group. It's known as Standing Together, Omdim B'yachad. Some of them decided that actually, in order to help de-escalate the conflict and show that Israeli society does care for our neighboring countries and Palestinian well-being, that they also raised money for Gaza food aid. These are humanitarian aid trucks that are landing in Jordan and driving through the West Bank to get to Gaza. And right-wing activists were stopping the trucks and throwing all of the food onto the highway in objection to Hamas getting any, like a Gazan, the premise being that all the aid was going to Hamas, which we know is not true. Some of it was and some of it wasn't. So these volunteers were sort of protecting the aid trucks. There's some innumerable examples of how some of these untold stories are part of what civil society does. They bring to life important things. I'm going to get into some. It's going to get tougher from here on out, folks. But then I promise that it won't get darker than that. This Israeli government does not believe in democracy. It doesn't really believe in some of the same checks and balances on that we believe in. And in particular, the far-right minister of the Israeli government, Ben-Gvir, has politicized the police force. He's the minister of the Israeli security. And a lot of the things that we are most concerned about in the deterioration of the rule of law in Israel has to deal with the conduct of the police. And these are work by Israel's equivalent of the Canadian Civil Liberties Union, or the ACLU. This is ACRI, the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. And they had litigation across they're a legal group, and they do litigation across every single issue in Israel. But how do we treat anti-war protesters? What are the rights of protest? This government really does not want any protesters of any kind, and so it will use all sorts of things, and it will bend the law to cancel protests or make it difficult or scary to protest. And we've seen the hostage families hurt, and we've seen legislators supporting the hostages hurt or arrested. Suppression of the press in one way or another. There was abuse of Palestinian detainees in Israeli military prisons. These are really tough things. And it's the job of civil liberties advocates in every society to stand up and say, actually, there's reasons that we just don't let government do anything. There's a limit, there's rules, there's rights, even for the most unpopular. Another important voice that's coming out of Israeli society are the voices of soldiers. There's a lot of bellicose talk about how brutal the IDF should be in Gaza, particularly by the sitting ministers of government. And some of it's a lot of talk, but some of it is showing up in the behavior of troops on the ground. And so it's, another important function of civil society is whistleblowers. When a government ministry or a public entity or a corporation, for that matter, is not following its own rules, or when it is doing things that are wrong or unethical, then people inside that institution will inevitably come out and say, well, actually our PR, the PR spokesperson said one thing, but actually I know it's not true because I did that thing that they say isn't happening. And in this case, there's the voices of Israeli reservists and Israeli soldiers who are saying, I'm the one on the ground in Gaza, and I can tell you we're not being particularly careful about innocence. And when you have one or two people say that, that's one thing. But when you have hundreds of people saying that, that's another thing. That's another important role of civil society. Another piece of civil society is like, how do we get out of this mess? Politicians, it might not shock you to say that politicians are not all the brightest, crayons in the crayon box. They rely in many cases on civil society to help point the direction. What will the public support? Give me some smart professors to tell me, how do we get out of this mess? What are the roads that, what are our roads out? So you see here, yeah, you're Lapid. He's the leader of one of Israel's centrist parties. He's been one of the candidates for prime minister basically over the past 10 years. You see him at a conference by an organization by Mitvim, which is a foreign policy think tank, which is providing answers to the questions of like, how do we get out of this mess? How do we end the war? How do we get to a two-state solution? Who are the Palestinian, or who are the Arab neighbors that could work with us? What would it mean to put an Arab government into Gaza so that Israel doesn't have to rule it? How do you get there? These are real complicated questions, and you need experts. And that's another role that civil society plays, is advising constructive alternatives. We talked about monitoring and evaluation. Israel has a whole plethora of human rights NGOs. These are Israeli NGOs. They're staffed by Israelis. These people served in the military who monitor human rights in the territories, for example. They all have their own specialty, but when we get into the conflicts, there's often like data. How many settlements are there? How many IDF are deployed over there? How many instances of terrorism happened? You need that information, and sometimes you can't trust the government because the government is run by politicians and they'll say whatever they can say in order to get reelected. You need a third-party validator. When it comes to more recently, again, the peace movement. The peace movement is civil society. That's what it is. It's a movement of many organizations, and this is an example of 50 organizations in Israel, Jewish, Arab, all citizens, who put together some incredible events to resuscitate the peace camp in the aftermath of October 7th. That are supporting the hostage families and also saying like the price of what we're doing in Gaza is too much. Another piece of further examples are public campaigns asking the public, is this the price you want to pay? These billboards all over Israel that they were a number of months ago, again, are examples of this same group that you saw do the joint Jewish Bedouin humanitarian aid distribution center, ran these ads, and they're asking, do we want to return to the Gaza envelope? Do we want to go back to the kibbutzim because they've been emptied, because they've been evacuated? Or do we want to go back and resettle Gaza inside Gaza? Do we want to save the hostages, or do we want to save this government's political hide? Do we want to send the reservists back to Gaza for a fourth tour of duty, or do we want to enlist the ultra-Orthodox? Right? Part of the role of civil society is to put issues on the public agenda for discussion, especially if the politicians aren't doing it or if the media isn't doing it. It's one of the many checks and balances of a vibrant democracy. Another issue that groups are raising is it's really hard in Israel to find a lot of compassion for Gazans, and that's to be expected in a wartime. But there are groups who say we must not lose our humanity, and we must also care for people suffering there. And they do ad campaigns, not Moana 2, not that one. That one's something else. Again, raising issues and putting them on the public agenda. That was a tour of a bunch of pro-democracy and in some cases expressly progressive civil society. There's also a lot of groups, there's lawyers associations, there's physicians associations. These are also active parts of civil society. They're more focused on, advocating for the needs of their professional sector, say. I want to skip all the way to the other end of the spectrum and say, like, boy, what are we talking about when we come to some of other parts of civil society that are also in Israel and that we hear from time to time? What do I mean by extremists? These are groups that like flatly oppose women's equality or gay rights. They oppose peace coexistence of Jewish-Arab relations of any kind. They oppose democracy. They advocate for like a religious state run by rabbis, or they're engaged in like, sort of doing their best to settle the West Bank and prevent a two-state solution. So there's lots of conservative groups that I disagree with them on this, that, or the other, or pre-trade policy, or the right balance of specific, legal rights and security concerns. I'm not talking about those. I'm skipping to the ones who are like, oh wow, this I think these ones are ones I think we can all agree are really difficult. And I just have a few examples. Like, for example, the Kohelet Policy Forum. This is a big think tank, a legal think tank that's been around for 15, 20 years. They are the architects of the judicial overhaul. They wrote about it, they designed it, they put it forward, they made recommendation handbooks about it. And then when this Israeli government came into power, people who are their staff and their trainees are basically the legislative aides to all of the right-wing members, and to the point where when the Israeli government, when the Israeli government was trying to push through its judicial neutering of the Supreme Court, and they were having negotiations with the opposition parties, they brought in a representative of the Kohelet Policy Forum to participate in the negotiations with them. Like, this is not a fringe group. This is the people in power now. You know, groups like Regavim is another settler organization that basically uses all the tools of civil society. They sue other organizations, they produce information, you know, research projects, they write books, they make films, and you know, one of the founders of it is Bezalel Smotrich. He's the leader of one of the most right-wing parties in Israel. One of the ones, you know, it's Smotrich is one of the two naysayers in the cabinet at the moment, saying, no, we will not end the war. No, we do not care about the hostages. You know, and we want to ethnically cleanse northern Gaza, right? Like, this is not a nice guy, and I'm not, you know, I don't think many people here would agree with him, even if you have some sympathy for the settlers. His institution is, you know, out there doing its thing, advocating for their views in society, and you can see that lots of their people are now actually in government. Thanks to Haaretz newspaper for this information. The Reform community has a special connection to Lahava. Lahava is I don't even know how to say this word, anti-miscegenation. Anyway, they don't want marriage or relations between Jews and Arabs, and they run around trying to like protest, and in many cases they're violent, they're enormously racist, trying to maintain the purity of the Jewish people. And of course, in their view, because they're very, very extremist in their religious views, Reform Jews aren't Jews as far as they're concerned. So they don't want marriage between Reform Jews and like you know, their version of orthodoxy. So it's a really special story to say. I'm sure maybe many of you may have heard of this. The Israel Religious Action Center of the Reform movement in Israel was successful in litigating against Lahava. And getting them deplatformed from social media. So Facebook, you know, they pressed the case with Facebook and some of the other social media networks, and got all of the social media platforms of Lahava like taken offline. They were in violation of so many things. This, I think, is one of my last examples of some of the really worrisome far right. This is Daniela Weiss and her organization Nachala. They're the people who have been holding conferences and advocating for the resettlement of Gaza. So they're the ones that want to depopulate all of Gaza. And they hold conferences, and they had a conference in February. 14 of 37 cabinet members attended their conference. Like, this is not a fringe movement. This is not like they may have been fringe, but now they are in government, which is, I think, explains some of the confusing messages coming out of the Israeli government. You sort of can't believe that they would be entertaining Trump's plan to the U.S. to take over Gaza. The reason is because there's a lot of people a part of this organization in government. They held Nachala was actually, they broke into Gaza. They crossed the Erez crossing. The IDF had to arrest them and sort of drag them back because they were going to go set up a settlement. Oh, that was a lot of really tough stuff. I'll add this last piece, is that everything I've mentioned to you so far are Israeli NGOs. They are organizations chartered in Israel. They usually have tax-exempt status as an organization in Israel. There's also groups that we hear about in Palestinian, like in the territories. They're not Israeli. Other organizations may be an Arab organization, like an Arab-Israeli organization, but there's also Palestinian civil society in the Palestinian territories, and they have an unenviable job of both advocating for their needs and their rights to the Israeli government, for Palestinian human rights, but also to the Palestinian Authority and to Hamas, like at the time that Hamas was before October 7th and they were ruling Gaza. So, actually what we want to see in Palestine and in Israel, Palestinian society and Israeli society is robust civil society of all kinds. We need it. We need it with the courts, with the free media, and checks and balances in the government. That is what's going to protect everybody. And the cacophony, the noise, the competing cases that all these different sectors of society make, that is what's going to actually protect all of us. So no surprise, this Israeli government that doesn't believe in that same definition of democracy, of course, has been advancing a number of some legislation to try and defund the kinds of organizations that believe in democracy and equality. So as well as its attempts to do that in the media and to the courts, all of these organizations that I have shown you are here in Canada. There are groups that fund them, there's groups that support them, from the settler extremist groups. We know that Regavim at one point got money through the federation system. Lots of the good ones also got money through the federation system. New Israel Fund is a booster for a lot of the ones on the progressive side. And of course, there's like sort of Canadian Friends of, everything in between, whether it's hospitals or universities or what have you. And actually, the truth is, here's my closing pitch is, why is all this important to you? Why should you know? Most of the money for all of these organizations comes from the diaspora. All of them. The Israeli philanthropy is just in development. It's growing, it's getting bigger, it's getting there. But most of Israel's nonprofit and charitable sector money comes from outside. So Kohelet received, we believe, $10 million from some mega philanthropist in Canada. It is possible to say that Canadian money helped in a great way, advance the judicial overhaul and the neutering of Israel's Supreme Court. We have a role, we are playing a role here already. The question is, where will you give your tzedakah? Where will you participate, and whose Israeli voices will you empower as you seek to support Israel, support Israelis, help the development and furtherment of that country? Are you putting it into something neutral? Are you putting it into something that advances something you believe in? And what is that doing for the whole country? So I obviously have my pick. I work with the New Israel Fund. I'm fighting for democracy and equality. But with that, I'll stop and let's do questions.
Ben, thank you so much. That was a terrific, not just an overview. You covered a lot of intellectual and activist space, but you drilled down into certain areas, and that was very, very helpful. I know that our colleague John Allen has been active in humanitarian organizations, both, I'm sure, during his time as ambassador, was lobbied by many organizations, and since he left government, has been involved in some. So let me invite John to either comment or make some offer you a question or two, and then Les and Rabbi Kay, should they wish to. And let me reiterate that those who are listening, if you have questions or comments, please use our Q&A function, and we'll get to them. John?
Thank you, David. Thank you, Ben. That was great. What a great overview. I'll just say that the Canadian government doesn't give the Canadian embassy in Israel any money to distribute. And so even though I had many groups coming to me, because the Norwegians and the Swedes and the Brits and others had money, our aid policy means that you don't have money in developed countries, and Israel is an OECD country. So there was money that went to the office in Ramallah, not a lot. Most of Canada's money goes to big organizations like the WHO and UNICEF, etc. But so I'm just suggesting, but we certainly spend a lot of time visiting the organizations that New Israel Fund funds, for example. And that was terrific. My question, though, is this: there's a Knesset bill. I'm not exactly sure where it is right now, but if passed, it would tax at 80% all of government funding to NGOs. They didn't want to touch private funding because private funding goes to both center right and center left, and Kohelet would lose its money if this government in Israel taxed it. But do you have a sense of what the impact that would be from talking to your colleagues, and how much money to civil society comes from government, and how much comes from organizations like yours and foundations and individuals? I mean, foundation money and individuals goes to organization like yours and mine, Rosanna, and then we send it there, but some goes directly to, I guess, I don't know. But those are sort of two separate questions, but I'd be interested in your views.
Sure. This is like, where is the anti-NGO bill, and what impact will it have if it were to happen? And the other one was, what is the big picture of foreign government funding in Israel?
Yeah.
So to explain the anti-NGO bill more in detail, this is a bill that mimics what Russia has passed under Putin and what Hungary passed under Viktor Orban. It's designed to cut the legs out from underneath civil society organizations that receive government funding. And everyone is obviously asking the question, like, why are foreign governments funding NGOs in other countries? Well, the reason is conflict zones receive a lot of international attention, and governments put a lot of money into monitoring and human rights monitoring in conflict zones. Correctly, I don't think the European governments should trust the Palestinian Authority or the Israeli government in exactly what they say is they're truly doing, or why, or what the facts are on the ground. In many cases, they want to hide what's happening on the ground because it's inconvenient. So foreign governments, allies, and these are all allies of Israel: France, Germany, the UK, Canada, other parts of the EU. A condition of Israel's participation in diplomatic relations or membership or access to EU markets is that you agree to the certain standards of access to each other's countries, and part of that goes with, you're a conflict zone, there's a conflict there, and we want to support accurate information coming out of it. So this current right-wing government, of course, doesn't want any of that, so they want to cut all that money off. There's a lot of really the good things that will get, that I think that I know will get cut also, just like a lot of Jewish-Arab dialogue and a lot of coexistence work, and a lot of Canada, John, has funded a bunch of women's empowerment groups over the past few years. After May 2021, they put several millions of dollars, about $10 million into some good people-to-people projects. This anti-NGO law is isolationist. It's basically saying all of those things, we're going to tax it at 80%. So basically, we're just going to take foreign governments' taxpayers' dollars for ourselves. And obviously, the foreign governments would just pull their money rather than hand it over to a government like this. So it would result in a collapse of certain organizations and many worthwhile projects doing all kinds of good things that are obviously they're meant to push back or to present alternatives to the current divisiveness. This government thrives off of divisiveness, so they don't want any of that. That's the part. That bill is stalled in committee. It was not brought for a conversation, partly because of the good organizing of Israel's opposition parties. They understand what a diplomatic own goal this would be. And also, Netanyahu's coalition they have a long list of anti-democratic legislation they would like to pass. And this is the favorite of the settler movement. But actually, this is not the top of Netanyahu's list. This is not the hill that he wants to die on. He wants the court override legislation, and he wants a few other things that'll get him out of corruption. That's his real interest, and his party's interest is keeping him out of, getting him out of his corruption trials. So this is not where they want to spend their political capital. So which is why it's not moving ahead as fast as as its advocates would like to see, Regavim in particular. Now to the question of total government funding in Israel, like outside, in any case, the majority of funding to civil society is private. Certain sectors, like particularly human rights fields, no matter what country you're in, no matter what conflict you're in, most of those are government funded. Groups like the New Israel Fund, our funding of those human rights groups, or let's say our right-wing equivalent who are funding the settler groups in a conflict zone are pretty minor, but in the big picture, but are enormously consequential. Governments move slow and private funders move fast. So if this extremist government gets elected and the settler movement, wants to take advantage of this opportunity, they'll raise a lot of money and they'll move fast. If we see the pro-democracy protest movement emerging out of the grassroots, we can move money and support the growth of that movement and its diversity in a way that like governments can't. And it was highly political, so foreign governments shouldn't do that in any case. That kind of civil society support. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much. I assume are foreign governments also making their views known about the fact that they don't want the money they are giving to groups taxed at 80%? I assume they are, or they should be.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of that is the behind the scenes diplomacy that you're well familiar with, and it is happening. That's if that money were to stop, and if those groups were unable to do their work protecting human rights, Israelis trying to protect human rights in Israeli society, then I think basically Israel moves further along the pariah state spectrum. It becomes much more like Turkey and Hungary and the Philippines. And so, I think Israel's allies don't want that. It will make it, much harder for the alliance with Israel to remain strong. It may, one of many things, this may be the drip that severs it from that. And I don't think any of us want that.
I just have a follow-up, if I may, David. You've had a right-wing government in power now for quite a while. Has that helped an organization like you to get funding, or has it hurt, or is it neutral? Are you getting more money because people realize that there are certain groups that need money, or I mean, it may be that you're just doing such a good job at raising money, you're getting more money. The other question is, what's happened since October 7th? I know, my organization has received less money from the Jewish community because they're probably giving their money, to only Israel organizations where they see this huge need following October 7th, to the kibbutzim or to aid organizations, etc. But I'm just wondering what's happened to your organizations, or if you know in the bigger picture.
Well, we can look at Israel philanthropy at large, and of course, in any time of crisis for Israel, the Jewish community opens up its hearts and its wallets and really invests like hundreds of millions of dollars. So we don't have an exact figure yet because it takes time for that stuff to get counted. But I wouldn't be surprised if it was like $500 million, if not $1 billion, that had been raised for Israel, all across the political spectrum. A one-time huge bump in Israel philanthropy. And so in that sense, I think partly what we're seeing after October 7th is a lot of people who were on the fence, not engaged, like diaspora Jews all over, pushed off the fence. So if you're right-wing, you're engaged in right-wing stuff and you're giving to right-wing stuff. If you're centrist, you're giving, whatever. If you want to give to advocacy stuff, or if you want to give to humanitarian aid, all of it is more. And so, like, at least our experience, and what I'm hearing from my colleagues all over the community, is that it's an enormous outpouring of sustained, high-level attention, interest, and giving. So in particular, like New Israel Fund of Canada, we typically raised $1 million a year. We raise $2 million a year now. And that happened at NAF in every single country across the globe. Israelis themselves made, we said that most of the philanthropy comes from outside of Israel, but actually the case for Israelis taking ownership of their society and not seeing fundraising as a thing that, like, you go schnorring to diaspora to your like New York cousin or your Toronto uncle, that it's something that we have to do for ourselves because like we have to take ownership of our society. Obviously, the government is not going to do it for us. Huge, way more than we have ever seen in Israel's entire history. Anecdotally, I would also say, like, in our space of like, a progressive relationship to Israel or engagement with these like the pro-democracy movement, I think this extremist Israeli government really has forced a conversation in the diaspora of what do we mean by support for Israel? What do we mean by support for Israelis? What do we do if we disagree with policy? Especially when there are some really vociferous critics from the pro-Palestinian community, some of whom advocate for dismantlement. Although the pressure to sort of maintain a united front might feel great, actually there are certain sectors of Israeli society that are leading us to a dead end, leading us down into a moral hole, and have pushed people to say, like, actually, I need to do more and I want to do more. And I think that is not just a progressive issue. That spanned all the way through to, I would say, the right wing of the community. I don't like Netanyahu. This is the things I hear from right-wing people. I don't like Netanyahu. He's a crook. He's made bedfellows with actual Jewish racists who want horrible things. Like, I don't care for the Palestinians one bit, but I don't think that they should be, I don't think we should participate in booting people out of Gaza forcibly, right? These are things that I hear right-wing people saying, and they have spoken out and they do speak out, and they're, looking for, what does it mean to have a relationship with Israel that supports our values, especially when this government seems to be so out of step with the majority of the diaspora? And that's really tough for some people. I'm comfortable with saying, I don't support this government. I'm going to support groups that have an alternative vision. But that's newer for some people. And I really think our Canadian community has really moved forward a number of steps in differentiating and understanding that our philanthropy is not neutral. It is not neutral. Where we give our money is picking sides in Israel. So pick a side that's gonna protect democracy and achieve your vision. There's a small portion of people who are in government right now who have a really, really extreme vision for Israeli society.
Okay, so that leads me into drawing a question from one of our viewers, Marcia Gilbert. They ask, what is the relevance of all of this to the forthcoming WZO, World Zionist Organization election? How will, for example, ARTSA delegates elected to the WZO impact those issues? And I think it would be helpful if you explain to our viewers, some of whom might not know, the significance of the WZO in terms of its budget and its allocations and what the elections.
The World Zionist Organization is a real interesting example because it's like it is civil society also, but it was created actually to be the government of Israel, and then the government of Israel got started, and now it's this sort of leftover institution. It happens to have a huge amount of money, and through a process of open elections in every Jewish community around the world, the Jewish community of the world can build basically like a legislature. It's not an official legislature of Israel, but it's a membership association. Essentially, it has a plenum, like a plenary, and it votes on how to spend its money. So the Israeli representation is determined by the way the Israel's elections actually unfolded, the actual political parties there. And the rest of us in the diaspora, like here in Canada, we can vote for, say, the Reform Zionist, association, or the Masorti Association, or there's ultra Orthodox, there's Russian, there's all this. Anybody who cares to can basically convene a party. It's wrong to call it a party because it's not official politics. This is not open. This is not a public office. It's basically a membership association. And they will send delegates to the World Zionist Congress, just like Theodor Herzl was, stood at, there's rooms in Vienna with all the Zionist delegates. This is the modern day extension of that same entity. They'll decide where to spend millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And the reform movement benefits by, the reform movement in Israel benefits from some of that money. But so do the settlers. The settlers use vote to have some of that money go to a settlement department that supports their caravans and their causes. And then in the diaspora, there's like people who, summer camps are sustained by that WZO money, and education, lots of places, or Aliyah, the Jewish Agency for Israel. That's the explanation of all of this. It's a very curious civil society, in that there's a lot of sort of advocacy around getting representation in it, in order to pass, resolutions at the plenum that stand for what the Jewish community of the world believes, and to sort of apportion out all that money. So it sort of exists in its own little world, but is also a representation of like some very uniquely Jewish civil society. I don't know of any diaspora community around the world that has an institution like this. And if the great concern at the moment is that there's ultra-Orthodox, there's new parties in Canada and around the world that represent ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox interests. They haven't been represented before, and they're being represented. They've started parties to represent themselves now, and that threatens to take a share of the seats and thus a share of the funding away from the reform movement and liberal causes and other things, which has very real effects in Israel and in diaspora communities around the world. So did that answer your question, David?
It's Marcia's question.
Oh, Marcia's question. Marcia, hi Marcia, thanks for your question. I hope that answered it, because it was
so.
how does this play into, how does civil society play a part in the WZO? It is civil society, and it's strange. It's a huge amount of money that will go basically to more civil society.
Right. So there's a question from Alex Zisman, which really is a follow-up to the initial conversation that you had, that John prompted. He asks, what will the New Israel Fund do with the money raised if the anti-NGO law goes through?
Yes, the NIF is private money. So it's private individuals giving to what basically is an organization that, a civil society organization that is making grants and funding projects in Israel. So none of it is government money. So it's actually not going to have an effect on if this, let's say this legislation gets passed, it's not going to affect you give money to New Israel Fund or you give money to the Jewish National Fund or anything else, UJA, whatever. It won't affect, it will not affect private money. However, obviously the causes that we're a part of, that NIF is a part of in Israel, we support some of those same institutions that are receiving funding for work in a conflict zone, or for peace and peace work, or for Jewish-Arab coexistence or shared society. So the cause that we care about will be deeply hit. All of the whole liberal side of the spectrum will be deeply hit if that bill comes into play. So that's why we have been particularly outspoken that not only is the bill anti-democratic, but it's going to have some real negative effects on the conflict. It will be harder for us to get out of the conflict if that bill passes.
Okay, thank you. Les.
I'd just like to talk a little bit about the shared society in Israel. And I've found over the years, there are so many small civil society organizations that talked about shared society. Now, after October 7th, maybe that's a little bit different. I'm not sure. But how effective are they outside of their sphere? I mean, they're very active within a certain sphere, whether or geographical territory. But how do you get them more effective so that they actually make a difference on a larger scale, right? When I've asked that in Israel, they said, well, it takes time.
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
But time marches on, and I don't know. I'm sort of curious to know what you think of, is it better to consolidate some of these organizations that are doing the same thing? They're trying to, talk about shared society or coexistence, but and there are some large ones, like ACRI, for example. I think it was
Mhm.
it's a larger one, but there are so many small ones, which I know you're familiar with because you fund quite a few of those. So what's your feeling on that?
Les, you asked the perfect question. I love it. The story of NIF is that in the 70s, again, when that civil society wave, that first civil society wave happened, there was a parallel development in the diaspora of people who were like, well, I want to give money to Israel. I want to give money to Israelis, but I want to give in Israel the same things I give here. I don't want to give Israel bonds. It'll just go to the government. I don't buy Canadian bonds as a charity to the government. I give to the women's movement in Canada, and I want to give to the women's movement in Israel. So that's where the match happened. And it was very obvious at that point that these were startups in Israel, like the startup nation, was true for everything. It was true for the civil society sector also. And so it was really obvious right from the beginning of giving money that we also had to give capacity building. And so the truth of the matter is that 50% of what NIF does in Israel is we actually give money. 50% of our work is capacity building, which is basically teaching civil society to do better. So looking at, let's say, the shared society piece of Israeli civil society, there's a bunch of organizations that do stuff. Some are legal groups, some are community organizing groups, some are attached to a specific profession, some are schools, like hand-in-hand schools. Some are Omdim B'Yachad. They sort of, they began doing like common cause for like get your potholes filled in a neighborhood that has both Jews and Arabs. Here's an easy thing that we can agree on. They succeeded in raising the minimum wage in Israel by a campaign they led. So there's important to be working on different things. But there is a point, like we're trying to move the needle as a society, as a sector on society, of the acceptance, the importance, the integration of Jews and Arabs in Israeli society overall. Because it's okay, but it's not great. So one of the things that is true is that we might have too many organizations, and it's true in cases where NIF has said, like, you two really need to get together. We'll give money to you if you get together. In fact, we might give you some money to help you merge. But actually, you're doing the same thing, and we won't give both of you money. Like, it's like realpolitik. You're stepping on each other's toes. Like there has to be something. And we have the advisors in our capacity building arm to help you figure out whether or not this is something you should do and how to do it. There's also, I want to give a good example of May 2021. If you remember, that was the last Gaza flare-up. There was violence on the streets of Israeli cities between Arab citizens and Jewish citizens. And we hadn't had that in decades. The return of it, the prospect of its return was terrifying. And it was many of these right-wing organizations, the extremist organizations that I just showed you, going into Arab neighborhoods and fomenting riots, basically, or saying things on social media, sort of instigate, some equally unsavory pieces of Palestinian citizenry to riot in response, right? These were instigated. And so we learned from that, the shared society community, the sector got together immediately afterwards and said, what happened? And it was NIF that convened it. What happened? What can we learn from this? What can we do differently? Where do you need money? Where do you need training? Where do you need communications networks? And so I'm really proud to say that October 7th was even worse than May 2021. It was so much more horrible. Why didn't we see riots? At the time, Ben Gvir, who's now our police minister, was like in those neighborhoods trying to stir up dissent. And now he's the police minister using the police not to stir up dissent, to stir up discontent. Now he's the police minister cracking down on Palestinians to try and provoke them into riots. And didn't happen, not once. And the instances of like sort of domestic terrorism in Israel from Arab citizens has been almost nil since October 7th. And part of the reason is because like all of this is worse than we could have possibly imagined. Why didn't we see riots on the streets? Because the shared society sector got together and said, we need a rapid response network, we need an information sharing, we need to know whose job is it to get on the ground in those neighborhoods when we see instigation, who's monitoring social media to those right-wing groups and the Jewish extremists and the Arab extremists when they proactively do this. We know from anti-Semitism in the diaspora, the haters find each other online and they purposefully go to a Jewish place and they stir up trouble. You can monitor those spaces and you can infiltrate them and you can stop it before it happens. So this broad network was put together with the single purpose of intervening and preventing flare-ups from within Israel from happening, and it's worked. And it didn't exist before May 2021. So your question is right. It's an organizing problem also. These institutions can exist or they can add up to more than the sum of their parts.
But for the post-October 7th,
Mhm.
was it not more the fact that a lot of the Arab communities felt that they were attacked as well? It wasn't only Jews that were killed on October 7th. And so they were just as unhappy with the government and what was happening and weren't willing, as opposed to May 2021.
That's a factor of it. There's also the intimidation of Ben Gvir's police force is also a factor of it. But, when you're talking about, pent-up rage and fear, and you're looking at Jewish extremists going into neighborhoods where they know they can provoke some teenagers, particularly, to throw a stone or to get into a street brawl, that still was happening, right? So, we're enormously proud of it. There's obviously other factors, but we can really proudly say that the Jewish Arab shared society sector of Israel saved lives. And that's
And there's another, at least one more interesting question from a viewer from Shalom Schachter. Following.
Hi, Shalom.
Has the New Israel Fund ever considered to fund Palestinian groups to establish and develop civil society in the West Bank that could pave the way eventually for a Palestinian body that can constitute a government which would live in peace with Israel? And I'd add the rider. What about the relationship between civil society among the Palestinian communities, both within Israel but also in the West Bank, and Israeli Jewish civil society? Because that would seem a way to extend a conversation and build common interests.
Yeah, this one I think is harder because I think as an institution, our mandate is to protect and advance democracy and equality in Israel. So, I often answer the question, like, where's the similar institution for Palestinian society? And I know from talking to some people in the Muslim, Arab, and Palestinian communities in the diaspora, there are moderate voices that think about that too. There's lots of jokes about Jews love institutions and we make a new institution every time we have a minor difference with each other. We love committees and umbrella groups. The truth of it is that we're just further along in this journey than they are. The quest to create a Jewish state goes back, a long ways. And we've had a lot of time to organize ourselves. And for us to develop different institutions for our different political slices, right? So I really wish I could say there was a Palestinian group doing Palestinian civil society. There isn't one group. They obviously raise most of their money from private individuals abroad. They're certainly not getting it from the PA or Hamas, because Hamas and the PA don't like those groups, because those groups exist to hold them, in check. You can imagine that Hamas does not want Palestinian feminist groups organizing in Gaza, right? Like that's what we're talking about here. So it's Israel's also a free society in a way that the West Bank and Gaza are not there yet. So it's easier for us to say, let's give money to good institutions doing good work in Israel because we are at least that much of a democracy and a free society. So let's appreciate that and the extra leg up that gives us in fighting for the things that we believe in. NIF won't do that work. That's beyond our mandate. It's beyond our expertise also. I want to say, like, it's important if, for these, if you're going to be giving money or aid to a group overseas, it doesn't matter who it is, you can't be a group of Canadians who just decide that X community in Africa needs a thing and then just give it to them. Like, you have to do it in consultation with them, and they have to be part of the decision-making process. In NIF, we have Orthodox board, the board in Israel is the board and staff are Orthodox, Russian, Ethiopian, secular, Mizrahi, Reform, people who live in the center of Israel, the extreme of it, the periphery of Israel. Palestinian citizens have to be on the board. Palestinian citizens have to be on the staff. They know what's best for their community, and you can't credibly say that you're benefiting them if they're not part of the decision-making process. So, you have to think about that when you're engaging in this too. We have only Israeli citizens. We don't have Palestinians. It's not our community. They have a responsibility for their society too. They need to get themselves organized.
Thank you. John.
Just to say, there are a couple of organizations, for example, EcoPeace, which the Canadian government does give money to, is a Palestinian, Jordanian, Israel environmental organization. So not in the area of good governance, but there are positive elements that bring people together, bring communities together, and obviously do good on the environment. And Rosanna is another organization. We don't get money from the Canadian government, but we got money from USAID until Donald Trump was elected, and that's an organization that actually works across border. And we're looking to GAC, to the government, to try and fund that. And that's, again, not pure governance, but it's capacity building in the health sector. So there are not a lot of organizations that are working cross-border, and I have the sense that most of the money that's going into Palestine is again going to the big organizations, as opposed to governance related.
So I think we're pretty well at our time. And Ben, I personally want to thank you very much. I know this took some of your time away from other things to prepare for this. And when I approached you, I asked that you stretch beyond just the New Israel Fund to the broader band of thinking about civil society at large and the range from left to right and center within Israel and in the diaspora. And it's certainly been a superb set of insights and an analysis, and we're most grateful to you. And hopefully, the growth of civil society will be an indicator of a strengthening liberal democracy in the years to come. With that, let me invite Rabbi Kay back on the screen and for a few words. Thanks, Ben, very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, David. Thank you to our panel and to our attendees who asked such wonderful, thoughtful, and impressive questions today. Just to reiterate, and I especially appreciate those of you who asked about the World Zionist Congress elections, that the election is imminent, June 5th through 15th. I hope you heard how important it is, and that your values in Israel are affected deeply by who is funding the appropriate sides in an ongoing ideological conflict. And the World Zionist Congress heavily affects where some of those funds go. And it is my hope and my explicit hope that you vote for Arts of Canada and the Reform movement to continue to push forward our values and to continue to push forward these liberal coexistence causes and these protections of LGBTQ+ rights, and to make sure that Israelis continue to be part of our liberal Jewish non-Orthodox society, and everywhere else. You can find more information about the World Science Congress elections coming up on the front page of our website, which will bring you to Arts of Canada, and you can learn more about what we do. And of course, I can't promise I will see you there, but I know you are there on Sunday when we have the Walk for Israel with UJA. So for those of you who are going to be with us, I look forward to waving at you in the crowd of thousands this coming Sunday morning. The walk begins at Temple Sinai, is my understanding. That's what's on their website. And you can find the Reform delegation. We're really walking as a community this year. So you can find the Reform delegation inside the Temple Sinai parking lot.
No.
There will be plentiful signs. No?
No.
Did that change less?
Yeah, no, we're meeting, we're meeting because it's not going to be big enough. We're meeting on Wilson, somewhere just east of Temple Sinai.
Okay.
And we have signs that say vote reform. So you just look for those, and we will hopefully find our reform colleagues.
So look for the Arts of Canada signs, and we will see you on Sunday. And thank you very, very much. David, your last word.
Yes. A week from today, our guest will be Professor Gabriel Ben-Dor, who's well known to this community. And we'll be in conversation with Gabi for our session next Thursday, the 29th, also at 12 noon.
Wonderful. Holy Blossomites, I'll send out an email tomorrow with very clear instructions that have been verified more than once by the Arts of Canada leadership about where we're meeting. Thank you all very much. Have a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben.